Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials, NATO analysts, and senior intelligence insiders had feared, tracked, and quietly prepared for. A development that unfolded not over months, not over weeks, but in a single day. A single day that forced Washington into immediate action. A single day that triggered Kyiv's most assertive response in weeks. And a single day that left Moscow confronting a narrowing set of options. What Vladimir Putin authorized this week crossed a line that the United States and its allies had hoped would hold at least long enough to avoid a direct escalation spiral. But when that line broke, Washington did not hesitate. They responded with speed, coordination, and strategic intent. And by the end of the day, the message was unmistakable. The pressure is no longer theoretical. It is operational, and it is being applied in real time. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal announcements, just persistent indicators that Moscow was preparing something out of pattern. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but it has also been disciplined in how it applies that aggression. Its moves have followed a recognizable cycle, a tempo, almost a ritual. Escalate just enough to test reaction. Pause to observe. Adjust, then escalate again. This rhythm has defined the war since its early phases. But what set off alarm bells in Washington, Kyiv, and NATO headquarters this time was not what Russia did, it was what it stopped doing. The pattern went silent. No major speeches. No doctrinal framing. No preparatory messaging from Kremlin-aligned media. Analysts who monitor Russian strategic behavior know what that means. They watch the indicators closely. The disappearance of routine Kremlin briefings, the pause in senior military communications traffic, the sudden rerouting of logistics flows, and the unexplained quiet from Moscow's strategic messaging apparatus. All of it went quiet at once. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, history suggests one thing. Something significant is about to happen. Not symbolic, not rhetorical, but material. Early this week, U.S. intelligence agencies, working alongside allied services, detected what they described internally as an abnormal shift in Russian operational posture. The shift included the activation of command and control elements that had not been fully engaged in over a year. These are not routine assets. These are the kinds of systems and movements that Russia only deploys when it is signaling something very specific. Escalation, to raise the stakes. Deterrence, to intimidate opponents. Or coercion, to force political concessions. Observers did not immediately know which category this move belonged to, or whether it belonged to all three at once. But what they did know was this. Russia was changing its strategic posture. And when a nuclear-armed power changes posture, even subtly, Washington pays attention. Especially when that shift comes without explanation. Especially when it comes amid growing battlefield pressure. Especially when it comes at a moment of visible strain inside the Russian system. The response issued by the United States was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior officials, speaking after high-level interagency and allied consultations, described Putin's move in unusually blunt terms. They called it deliberate, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, calculative, designed to test Western resolve. This was not dismissed as posturing. This was treated as a live strategic challenge. But pressure tactics only work if the target hesitates. Washington did not hesitate. In fact, the response that followed was among the most coordinated and rapid we've seen since the early months of the war. Within hours of confirmation, military aid pipelines were accelerated. Intelligence sharing with Kyiv was expanded. Operational authorizations that normally take weeks were granted in days. These were not the ordinary measures announced in press releases. These were high-end systems and permissions tools that the U.S. and its allies reserve for moments when they believe escalation control is at risk. The kind of tools deployed when the objective is not just support, but deterrence through capability. And critically, this response was paired with immediate coordination with Ukraine, because Washington understood something fundamental. If Moscow was attempting to change the equation through pressure, the only effective response was to change the equation on the ground. And that brings us to what happened next. Because while Washington was moving at the strategic level, Kyiv was already preparing its response. And when Ukraine moved, it did so with precision, not impulsively, not symbolically, but with a clear operational purpose. Tonight, Western defense sources confirmed that Ukraine, operating with expanded intelligence support and near real-time coordination, launched precision counter-operations across multiple theaters. The actions targeted Russian logistics and command infrastructure, including a forward logistics hub that had recently been reactivated and reinforced for what analysts believe was a preparatory phase for broader offensive action. Ukraine moved before Moscow could lock in those gains. They struck ammunition storage nodes. They struck rail and road transfer points. They struck command relay sites that were assessed to be preparing to coordinate follow-on operations. In other words, Kyiv targeted the connective tissue of escalation. The component that would have made a larger move operational. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Because Moscow's move wasn't symbolic. It wasn't messaging. It was actionable. Left unchecked, it represented the kind of shift that could have expanded the conflict's intensity and narrowed diplomatic off-ramps. Ukraine understood that risk and responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike population centers. They didn't escalate horizontally. They didn't chase headlines. They hit what mattered. And the speed of that response mattered just as much as its precision, because timing is leverage. And this time, Ukraine seized it. Multiple intelligence sources now believe that Vladimir Putin authorized this posture shift to probe the cohesion and stamina of the Western alliance after months of political friction, funding debates, and election year uncertainty. The Kremlin wanted to see whether fatigue had set in, whether hesitation had crept into decision-making, whether Ukraine's partners would blink. The expectation inside Moscow was not total capitulation, but delay. A pause, a debate, a moment of indecision. That pause never came. Instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't stall, Kyiv didn't flinch, and the alliance didn't fracture. The response was so swift, so coordinated, and so deliberately calibrated that even Moscow took notice. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but this time it did. A senior defense analyst, speaking with international media under anonymity, described Moscow's maneuver as pressure testing through ambiguity, a way to regain initiative without committing to full escalation. But Ukraine and its partners proved something essential. They remained both alert and decisive. Their actions were not only firm, they were precise, down to sequencing, targeting logic, and escalation management. That precision matters because it reveals intent. It shows Ukraine is not reacting blindly. It shows Washington is not improvising. It shows the alliance is actively shaping the battle space, not merely responding to it. Ukraine is not a passive recipient of support. It is an active operational partner integrating intelligence, executing complex strikes, and denying Moscow the predictability it once relied on. As reports continued to come in throughout the day, the scale of Ukraine's response became clearer and more significant. Here's what we now know. Ukrainian long-range fires units carried out synchronized strikes, forcing Russian formations to disperse and reposition, disrupting planned timelines. Specialized targeting cells hit infrastructure that had been reactivated within the last 72 hours, indicating accurate current intelligence. Naval and air monitoring elements operating near contested zones reportedly tracked and constrained movements used by Russia to signal pressure. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't retaliation. This wasn't optics. This was operational disruption. This was initiative denial. And initiative denial is the one thing Moscow has struggled to maintain since mid-2023. For every advance Russia attempts, Ukraine counters with something that raises costs, compresses timelines, and forces Moscow back into reactive mode. The effect compounds. Because when you force an adversary to constantly replan, you sap momentum. When you deny them clean execution, you introduce friction. And when you do it repeatedly, you shift the balance not through spectacle, but through attrition of options. That is what we're witnessing now. And this brings us to the broader picture, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. What we're seeing today is not just a tactical exchange, it's the product of years of assumptions colliding with reality. And to understand why this moment matters so much, we need to step back and look at the history that led us here. To understand why this moment feels so charged, why it feels different, you have to return to the assumptions that shaped the earliest days of this war. Vladimir Putin believed three things would hold. First, he believed Ukraine would fracture politically, socially, militarily under sustained pressure. Second, he believed the West would tire, that unity would erode under economic strain and political cycles. Third, he believed time would work in Russia's favor, that endurance alone would deliver leverage. Each of those assumptions has been tested, and each has failed. Ukraine did not fracture. It adapted. Western unity did not collapse. It hardened unevenly at times, imperfectly, but decisively. And time did not tilt toward Moscow. It became an adversary. What we are seeing now is not a sudden crisis. It is the accumulated weight of miscalculation meeting resistance. Tonight, the opposite of those early assumptions is unfolding in real time. Ukraine is operationally confident. Western coordination is faster, not slower. And Russia's strategic space is narrowing, not expanding. History matters here because it explains why pressure is now being applied and why it's being applied with such precision. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Russia's latest move comes at a time when Putin himself is under compound pressure. This pressure is not abstract. It is internal, it is political, it is structural. Different factions within the Russian system are pulling in different directions. Military hardliners want escalation, more force, fewer constraints. Economic technocrats want predictability, sanctions, relief, stability, trade. Regional elites want resources redirected inward. Security services want control, narrative control, social control, institutional dominance. Putin is balancing these demands while managing an ongoing war that refuses to resolve cleanly. And when leaders in that position make sudden, ambiguous moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from constraint. They're doing it from a shrinking margin for error. That context matters because it reframes Moscow's behavior. This is not confidence. This is compression. The response from the United States was deliberately calibrated and unmistakably firm. Washington's official statement, now circulated through allied diplomatic channels and reinforced in private briefings, was designed to send a clear signal. The United States is not willing to allow unilateral escalation. Officials said plainly that Russia's recent actions were inconsistent with regional stability and established norms. That's diplomatic language. Translated into plain English, it means, this will not be tolerated. You do not hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. There was no theatrical language, no dramatic threats, just clarity. And clarity, in moments like this, is power. Meanwhile, Ukraine's response was not limited to the battlefield. Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressed the nation and the international community in a speech that was both measured and resolute. He spoke plainly. He said, Ukraine will respond to every threat against our people and our sovereignty. He said, our partners understand what is at stake, and they are acting. And he said, we are not asking for sympathy. We are defending our future. These were not rhetorical flourishes. They were strategic statements. They were signals not just to Moscow, but to allies watching closely. Ukraine is not pleading. Ukraine is asserting, and that distinction matters because it underscores how far Kyiv has come from a state fighting for survival to a state shaping outcomes. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning and more complex. Russia's latest move did not occur in isolation. Alongside it, Belarus conducted expanded readiness drills, amplifying uncertainty along Ukraine's northern flank. Russian naval elements increased patrol activity, particularly in contested maritime zones. Coordinated information and cyber operations spiked, targeting both Ukrainian morale and Western public opinion. All of this unfolded within the same narrow time window. That matters. Because when Moscow moves multiple pieces at once, it signals something larger than a single tactical decision. It suggests orchestration. It suggests synchronization. It suggests a bid to overwhelm decision-making cycles. But this time, that attempt met resistance, not confusion. And that resistance is reshaping the calculus. So where does this leave us? We've seen the pressure. We've seen the response. We've seen the widening context. What comes next is the most critical question of all. Because now, analysts are weighing the paths Moscow might take and which ones are no longer available. Analysts across Washington, Brussels, and Kyiv are now weighing several possibilities, each with profound implications. One possibility is that Vladimir Putin is preparing a controlled escalation, a limited but visible move designed to reassert initiative without triggering direct confrontation with NATO. Another possibility is that Moscow is attempting to force negotiations by manufacturing urgency, raising the perceived costs long enough to compel talks on its terms. But the third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that the Kremlin is attempting to test red lines deliberately, probing how far pressure can be applied before the response becomes intolerable. That third path is the most dangerous. And today, Ukraine and its partners removed that option from the table. They didn't delay, they didn't dilute, they didn't defer. They responded decisively. By doing so, they made clear that ambiguity would not buy Moscow leverage. What we are watching now is a test of resolve. Moscow wants to see whether sustained pressure will produce hesitation. Kyiv wants to demonstrate that pressure produces resistance. Washington wants to prevent a wider war. NATO wants to preserve deterrence credibility. These objectives collide in moments like this. And how each actor behaves now will shape the next phase of the conflict, not just militarily, but politically. Because tests are not just about strength, they are about belief. Belief in alliances, belief in commitments, belief in consequences. Tonight, multiple sources confirm that monitoring has intensified across all domains: air, land, sea, cyber, and information. They say Russian units are reassessing posture rather than advancing. They say command elements are reevaluating timelines. And they say Moscow's decision to shift posture now appears to be part of a broader pressure campaign intended to regain initiative without triggering escalation it cannot control. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is consolidating gains. Their response today, measured, coordinated, and deliberate, sent a clear message to Moscow. Escalation will be met with capability, not confusion. And it sent a message to allies. Ukraine is not merely enduring, it is shaping outcomes. As the days ahead unfold, more details will emerge about what Moscow hoped to achieve with its latest move. But what we know now is this: the response from the United States and its partners was timely. It disrupted escalation pathways, it reinforced deterrence, and it restored strategic balance at a critical moment. What happens next will depend on what Moscow chooses to do in the coming days. If it steps back, this moment may be remembered as a turning point when pressure failed and restraint prevailed. If it does not, Washington and Kyiv have already shown something essential. They are prepared, they are aligned, and they are ready to respond again. And tonight, for the first time in many months, the Kremlin is quiet. Moscow is quiet. Its messaging is restrained. Its signals are muted, too quiet. And when Moscow goes quiet, it means decisions are being weighed carefully. Because tonight, the Kremlin learned something it has learned before, but perhaps never so clearly. Resolve matters. Unity matters. And pressure has consequences. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is unmistakable. Ukraine held the line. The United States tightened the screws. And Moscow found its options narrowing. And we will be here watching every move as the next phase unfolds.